Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that I'm pretty sure most of us have either experienced firsthand or at least witnessed at some point in our careers. Micromanagement. Ugh. I mean, where do we even begin with this one? We've got insights from folks on YouTube who've been on both sides of this, right? Like those who've been micromanaged and those who maybe realized they were the micromanager. And we've also got some really solid advice from an article we found about how to survive a micromanaging boss. So get ready, because we are going deep.
What's really fascinating is that a lot of times micromanagement actually comes from a good place. The YouTube experts were saying that often micromanagers were like those star employees, the ones who excelled in their roles and then got promoted. But they sort of missed that crucial step of learning how to lead and empower others.
Yeah, it's like they go from being the individual rock star to suddenly having to manage a whole band.
Yeah.
And they kind of bring that same intense focus on every single note, every single detail, to a role that really needs a totally different approach.
Exactly. And because they haven't quite grasped how to delegate effectively or to trust their team, they end up clinging to this need for absolute control. And our text source, oh man, it really hammered home just how damaging that can be. Like it listed out all these consequences: soaring stress levels, morale plummeting, creativity getting totally stifled.
It's almost like they create this pressure cooker of an environment. And nobody can really thrive in that kind of pressure. And what's crazy is the article also pointed out the impact on the micromanager themselves. They're stressed out, overloaded, basically running on fumes. Not exactly a recipe for effective leadership.
Right. It becomes like this awful cycle. But here's where things get really interesting. Those YouTube videos had some surprisingly insightful advice for managers who want to break out of that micromanagement pattern. And it all starts with realizing that delegation isn't about just dumping your responsibilities on someone else. It's about empowering your team.
So it's less about being a control freak and more about becoming like a coach, guiding and supporting the team instead of calling every single play.
Exactly. One of the YouTube experts called it results-oriented delegation. You define the desired outcome, let your team figure out their methods, and you offer support without hovering. It's a total mindset shift, right? From do it my way to here's the goal, how can we best achieve this together?
Love that. It makes so much sense. I bet that approach not only boosts team morale and productivity, but it probably frees up the manager's time and headspace too, so they can focus on bigger picture leadership stuff.
Absolutely. And another key piece of advice that came up a lot was self-awareness for managers. One of the experts even suggested talking to someone you trust, someone who will give you honest feedback about your management style. It takes a lot of vulnerability, but it's so crucial if you want to identify those micromanaging tendencies and figure out how to adjust.
It's kind of like taking a step back and asking yourself, am I the magnifying glass always searching for flaws, or am I the coach offering guidance and encouragement?
Yeah. It's exactly that. Okay, but now let's flip the script for a second. Let's talk about those who are on the receiving end of micromanagement. Because let's be real, it's tough.
Yeah.
And our article captured that frustration perfectly, but it also had some tactical advice on how to reclaim some sanity and agency when you're in that situation.
One thing that really stood out to me was the idea of trying to understand the micromanager's perspective. It's easy to jump to conclusions, right, and assume they're just being malicious. But often it's more about their own insecurities, like a fear of failure or a lack of trust. A little empathy can go a long way in changing the dynamic.
For sure. And both the article and the YouTube videos emphasize the power of proactive communication. Keeping your manager in the loop with regular updates, setting really clear expectations, and sharing your thought process, all of that can give them the reassurance they need, which might give you a little more breathing room.
It's like getting ahead of those anxieties before they turn into a million check-ins and directives. But the article also pointed out something really important: setting boundaries. It's not always easy, but it's crucial.
So true. Setting those boundaries can feel intimidating, especially when it's your boss. But the article suggested framing it as a win-win situation. Emphasize how giving you more autonomy actually leads to greater efficiency and effectiveness.
So it's not a defensive back-off. It's more like, hey, if I can focus on this without constant interruptions, I can deliver even better results which benefit everyone.
Right. Exactly. It's about appealing to that desire for excellence while also setting clear parameters for how you work best. But here's the thing. What happens when all those good intentions, the communication, the empathy, the boundary setting, what if none of it's enough? What if the micromanagement is creating a truly toxic environment?
That's a tough one. And unfortunately, it's the reality for some people. But the good news is that one of the YouTube videos offered some really concrete steps for escalation.
Okay, so step one, and this is key. You have to offer sincere, and I mean truly sincere feedback directly to the micromanager. And this is not about complaining or venting, okay? It's about giving them a genuine chance to course correct.
It's a brave conversation to have, I get it. But framing it as, hey, I've noticed this behavior and it's impacting our work. Is there any way we can adjust this to be more effective? It opens up a dialogue without putting them on the defensive.
Exactly. And if that direct approach doesn't lead to any change, the next step, according to the YouTube expert, is to find a trusted intermediary, someone close to the boss who can offer an objective perspective and maybe help the manager see the issue in a new light.
So it's not about going behind their back. It's about finding an ally who can help facilitate a more productive conversation.
Right. But now we have to acknowledge that sometimes even our best efforts just don't work. The YouTube expert was very clear about this. There are times when involving HR or exploring new job opportunities might be the only viable options if the situation is truly toxic.
It's a harsh reality, but it's important for everyone to remember that their well-being matters. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is recognize when it's time to create a healthier environment for yourself, even if it means making a difficult change.
You're absolutely right. Staying in a toxic environment can be so damaging, no matter how hard you try to fix it.
This has been so insightful. I know our listeners are eager to hear more about how to navigate this whole micromanagement maze.
Yeah, it can be a real challenge. But before we move on from that, I think it's important to point out that micromanagement often stems from deeper leadership issues.
Yeah.
If you're a manager and you're starting to recognize these tendencies in yourself, well, it might be a sign that you need to invest in some skills development, maybe some coaching or even mentorship.
That's a really good point. It's not just about us escaping the maze. It's about maybe helping someone else find the exit too,
Right.
right? So, okay, we've covered a lot about the why and the how of micromanagement from both the manager's perspective and the employees.
Yeah, we've hit on a lot of key points.
But now I think it's time to shift gears a little bit and talk about conflict resolution in the workplace. Because, let's face it, when you've got a micromanager involved, conflict is almost inevitable.
Totally. That's a great transition. The text source we found didn't really delve into conflict resolution specifically, but one of the YouTube videos had this really helpful 6-step framework that I think we can apply here.
Oh, perfect. Lay it on us. What are the steps?
Okay, so the framework starts with preparation, basically setting the stage for a productive conversation. So that means gathering all the relevant information, choosing a neutral location to meet, and most importantly, establishing a respectful and collaborative tone from the get-go.
So it's less about pointing fingers and being accusatory like you did this wrong, and more about a collaborative approach like, hey, how can we work together to make things better?
Exactly. Once you've got the stage set, the next step is active listening. And I mean truly listening, without interrupting or judging. This is where empathy comes in. It's about making a genuine effort to understand the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
Trying to put yourself in their shoes and see things through their eyes. It's funny because that's exactly what we were just talking about with understanding the micromanager's perspective, right?
Yeah.
It all ties together.
It totally does. Empathy is such a crucial skill, no matter if you're dealing with a micromanaging boss or just resolving a conflict with a colleague. Okay, so after everyone's had their chance to share their perspective, the next step is to identify common ground and key differences.
So finding those points of agreement like shared goals or desired outcomes,
Okay.
but also acknowledging those areas where your perspectives differ.
Exactly. And you got to do this without judgment or getting defensive. It's about recognizing that people can have different viewpoints and still work towards the same goal. Once you've done that, you can move on to step 4, exploring solutions collaboratively.
Brainstorming time. This is where you start generating ideas and potential options for moving forward. Again, everyone gets to contribute their thoughts and perspectives.
Absolutely. It's not about one person dictating the solution. The goal is to find a win-win outcome that addresses everyone's needs and concerns. And once you've explored all the possibilities and come to a consensus, you move on to step 5, agreeing on a plan and the next steps. This is where you get specific about who's responsible for what the deadlines are, and how you'll measure progress.
Turning those big ideas into a concrete action plan with clear accountability. I like it.
Exactly. And the final step, follow up and review. This is so crucial because it ensures that the plan you all agreed on is actually being implemented effectively and that everyone's staying on track. It's also a chance to address any new challenges or roadblocks that might pop up along the way.
Makes sense. So you're not just coming up with a plan and then forgetting about it.
Hmm.
You're making sure it actually works in practice.
Exactly. Now, one of the key takeaways from that YouTube video about this framework was that emotional intelligence is a critical component of effective conflict resolution.
Oh, that's interesting. I've heard of emotional intelligence, but I'm not sure I fully understand how it applies in this context.
Well, emotional intelligence, or EI, is basically the ability to understand and manage your own emotions, as well as to recognize and empathize with the emotions of others. And those skills are like gold in a conflict situation.
I can see that. When emotions are running high, it's easy to say or do things we regret. So how can we develop and use our emotional intelligence to handle conflict better?
So, the YouTube video broke down emotional intelligence into five main components. The first one is self awareness. It's all about understanding your own emotional state and what your triggers are. What makes you angry, what makes you sad, what makes you shut down completely.
It's like being in tune with those internal cues and recognizing how our emotions are affecting our behavior.
Yeah. The second component is self regulation. It's the ability to control those impulses and manage your emotional reactions. It's about staying calm and composed even when things get heated.
I imagine that's a lot harder to do than to say, especially when you're in the middle of a tense conflict.
You're telling me.
Right.
It definitely takes practice. But the more we can develop that ability to pause, take a deep breath, and choose a more constructive response, the better we'll be at handling conflict effectively. Now, the third component, and we've already talked about this a bit, is empathy.
Right, empathy. That's the ability to not just recognize someone else's emotions, but to actually put yourself in their shoes and try to see the world from their perspective.
Exactly. Empathy is the bridge that connects us to others, even when we disagree. It's essential for building trust and finding common ground when there's conflict. The fourth component is social skills, which includes things like communicating effectively, building rapport, and basically navigating social situations with grace.
So things like active listening, clear communication, and being able to manage difficult conversations with tact and diplomacy.
Exactly. And the fifth and final component is motivation. This is all about your inner drive to find a positive outcome. It's about wanting to resolve the conflict in a way that benefits everyone involved, not just yourself.
So approaching the conflict with a collaborative mindset, trying to find a win-win solution, rather than just trying to win at all costs.
Exactly. And when you have that genuine motivation to find a positive resolution, it shows in your attitude and how you approach things. And it can be really inspiring to others.
This breakdown of emotional intelligence is so helpful. It really clarifies how these different pieces work together to help us navigate conflict more effectively.
I agree. And it's a good reminder that developing our emotional intelligence is a journey, not a destination. The more we can cultivate these skills, the better we'll be at handling the inevitable challenges and conflicts that come up in our work and personal lives.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, understanding how micromanagement works, exploring effective strategies for conflict resolution, and now delving into the world of emotional intelligence. It really has. And you know what would be helpful? I think seeing how these concepts play out in real-world scenarios. What kind of comes to mind for you?
Okay, let's imagine a classic micromanagement situation. We'll call it the over-editor.
Hmm.
So picture this talented writer working on a really important project, super passionate, very skilled, but their manager, we'll call him Ted, is a total micromanager. Ted insists on reviewing every single sentence the writer drafts, makes these tiny little edits that don't really improve the writing, but they totally disrupt the flow and just chip away at the writer's confidence.
Ugh. I can practically feel the writer's frustration building with every single red line. It's like Ted's trying to force his own style and voice onto the writing instead of trusting the writer to use their expertise.
Exactly. And as you can probably guess, this leads to a demoralized writer. Their creativity gets stifled, and the project ends up taking twice as long to finish. Total lose-lose situation.
Absolutely. So how could Ted have handled this differently? How could he have applied those principles of effective leadership and emotional intelligence we were just talking about?
Well, for starters, instead of hovering over every single word, Ted could have set clear expectations right from the beginning of the project. Outline the main goals, the tone and style they're going for, the overall message they want to convey.
That would give the writer a framework to work within, but still let them use their own creativity and judgment.
Exactly. And instead of micromanaging every step of the way, Ted could have scheduled regular check-ins to review progress and offer feedback. but in a more constructive and supportive way.
Focusing on the big picture, the clarity, the impact, the overall effectiveness of the writing, instead of getting bogged down in tiny grammatical details.
Exactly. And the writer could also proactively communicate their progress to Ted, share any challenges they're facing, and seek feedback at key points. It's about building a collaborative relationship based on trust, not one that's controlling and adversarial.
I like that. It's a great example. It shows how even small shifts in approach can completely change the dynamic of a team.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds us that micromanagement often comes from this lack of trust and poor communication, not necessarily from a genuine desire to be overbearing.
Okay, so we've seen how this plays out in a creative setting. But what about a situation where conflict arises because people have different opinions or priorities?
Hmm.
Like what about two team members, let's say Sarah and David, who are butting heads over a project deadline?
Oh, yeah, the classic deadline dilemma. So Sarah's feeling all this pressure to meet this deadline that's probably unrealistic, while David's worried that rushing the project is going to sacrifice quality. The tension starts building, emails are flying back and forth, and the project starts to suffer.
Oh, I've been there. So how can Sarah and David use that six-step conflict resolution framework we talked about to get through this?
Well, ideally, their manager would step in and help facilitate a productive conversation. Like we discussed, the first step is to create that safe, neutral space where Sarah and David both feel comfortable sharing their thoughts openly and honestly.
No finger pointing, no interrupting,
Yeah.
just active listening
Yeah.
and a genuine effort to understand each other's point of view.
Exactly. And once they've both had a chance to express their concerns, the next step is to identify what they agree on and where their views differ. In this scenario, they probably both want the project to be successful and they both value quality. The sticking point is that deadline.
Right, so how do they bridge that gap?
That's where the collaborative problem solving comes in. Can they adjust the deadline a bit? Are there certain tasks they can prioritize or streamline? Could they bring in more resources or maybe adjust the scope of the project to relieve some of that pressure?
So it's about finding creative solutions that address everyone's concerns, not just digging in their heels and defending their own position.
You got it. And once they've explored some options, they can move on to agreeing on a plan and outlining those next steps. This means clearly defining who's doing what the new timeline is, and putting it all in writing so everyone's on the same page.
And then, of course, that crucial last step, following up and reviewing to make sure the plan is working and tackling any new challenges that come up.
Exactly. It's about turning that conflict into a chance for growth and collaboration, not letting it fester and drag the whole team down.
These real-world examples have been so helpful. It's great to see how these concepts actually play out and how we can use them to make our work lives better.
I agree. And it's a good reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, whether it's by changing our own behavior, addressing conflict in a healthy way, or just speaking up for a more positive and productive work environment.
So well said. This deep dive has been a real journey. We've explored the ins and outs of micromanagement, uncovered the power of emotional intelligence, and learned some practical strategies for resolving conflict effectively.
It all comes full circle. By developing our self-awareness, our empathy, our communication skills, we can create work environments that are more harmonious and productive for everyone.
It's been fantastic diving into all of this with you. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and insights with our listeners.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always great to talk about these important issues and explore ways to make our work experiences more positive and fulfilling.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've come away with some valuable tools and a renewed sense of empowerment to navigate the ups and downs of today's workplace.
Remember, you have the power to create positive change for yourself and for your team. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to build a work environment where everyone can truly thrive.
And until next time, keep diving deep.